welcome, little listeners, to tonight's bedtime story on our magical podcast, where dreams take flight and adventures are as big as your imagination. Tonight, we journey into a quiet library, where boisterous young boy learns the power of silence. Join us as we discover how the loudest lessons can be learned in the quietest places. Snuggle up, close your eyes, and let's begin our whispered adventure. Oscar was a whirlwind of energy packed into a small 7-year-old frame. With wind-swept brown hair that never stayed neat and bright green eyes that sparkled with mischief, he was always in motion. His mother, Sarah, often joked that he had ants in his pants. "Oscar, honey," Sarah would say, watching him bounce around the living room. "If we could harness your energy, we could power the whole neighborhood." Oscar would giggle and zoom past her, his laughter filling the house. His voice was as vibrant as his personality. Loud, clear, and always ready to share whatever thought popped into his head. In school, Oscar's enthusiasm often got the better of him. His second-grade teacher, Ms. Johnson, a patient woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, had to remind him frequently about volume control. "Oscar, indoor voice, please," she'd say, at least 3 times a day. Oscar would look up from his excited conversation, his eyes wide. "But Miss Johnson," he'd reply, his voice carrying across the classroom, "I'm just so excited about the solar system. Did you know Jupiter has 79 moons?" His classmates would giggle, and Miss Johnson would shake her head with a mix of amusement and exasperation. Oscar loved stories, especially comics about superheroes. He'd spend hours poring over colourful pages, occasionally shouting out, "Pow!" or "Zap!" Despite his love for books, he'd never been to a library. His mom usually bought him books or borrowed them from friends. One Tuesday morning, Miss Johnson made an announcement that set Oscar's world abuzz. "Class, we're going on a field trip to the library tomorrow." Oscar's eyes lit up like fireworks. He turned to his best friend, Jamie, practically vibrating with excitement. "A whole building full of books, Jamie! Can you imagine?" The next day, Oscar bounced into the school bus, chattering non-stop to Jamie about the upcoming adventure. As they entered the library, Oscar's jaw dropped. The library was enormous, with tall shelves stretching up to the ceiling and rows upon rows of books. Without thinking, Oscar yelled, "Wow! This place is awesome!" His voice echoed through the quiet building like a clap of thunder. Several heads turned to look at him, some frowning deeply. An older man reading a newspaper shook his head disapprovingly. Miss Johnson quickly put her finger to her lips, her eyes wide with alarm. "Remember, Oscar," she whispered urgently, "we need to be quiet in the library. Other people are trying to read and concentrate." Oscar nodded vigorously, but the excitement bubbling inside him was hard to contain. "Sorry, Miss Johnson," he whispered back, though his whisper was more like a stage voice. "I'll be super quiet, I promise." No sooner had he made this promise than he spotted a book with a dinosaur on the cover. He zoomed off to grab it, his sneakers squeaking loudly on the floor. "Jamie!" he called out, forgetting to whisper, "Look at this book. It has a T-Rex on it." The kind librarian, Mrs. Page, a woman with silver hair and glasses perched on her nose, approached Oscar. Her eyes were gentle but concerned. "Young man," she said softly, bending down to Oscar's level, "we use our whisper voices in the library. Other people are trying to read and concentrate." Oscar nodded vigorously, his curls bouncing. "Sorry," he stage-whispered back, still loud enough to turn heads. "I'll be quiet as a mouse." Mrs. Page smiled patiently. "That's good. Why don't you try reading in our cozy corner? It's perfect for young readers like you." Oscar tiptoed away, exaggerating each step in an attempt to be quiet. His exaggerated movements caused him to bump into a book cart, sending several books tumbling to the floor with loud thuds. "Oops," Oscar exclaimed, quickly clapping his hands over his mouth as he realized he'd shouted again. In the reading corner, Oscar plopped down on a beanbag next to a girl about his age. She was deeply engrossed in a book about butterflies. "Hi, I'm Oscar," he whispered, though it came out much louder than intended. The girl jumped, startled by his loud whisper. "What are you reading?" "I love butterflies. Did you know some of them migrate thousands of miles?" She gave him an annoyed look and moved to another beanbag, clutching her book tightly. Oscar felt a pang of hurt. He was just trying to be friendly. He picked up a book about space and tried to read, but he couldn't help tapping his foot rhythmically against the floor and humming the theme from his favorite cartoon. A nearby student looked up from his book, frowning. "Can you stop that?" he hissed. "I'm trying to study." Oscar bit his lip, feeling confused and a little frustrated. He loved books and stories, so why was it so hard for him to fit in at the library? Just then, he heard an announcement that made his ears perk up. "Attention, everyone," Mrs. Page's soft voice came over the speaker. "We'll be having a special storytelling session in the children's section in 5 minutes. All are welcome to join." Excited by the prospect of a story, Oscar jumped up, accidentally knocking over a small stack of books. Wincing at the noise, he quickly picked them up and then raced to the children's section, his feet pounding on the floor despite his best efforts to be quiet. He arrived just as the storyteller, Mr. Wordsworth, a tall man with a colourful vest and a warm smile, was settling into a big armchair. Children were gathering around, sitting cross-legged on a large, colourful rug. "Today, we're going on an adventure with the Whispering Wizard," Mr. Wordsworth said in a soft, captivating voice. As the story began, Oscar found himself drawn in. Mr. Wordsworth's quiet voice made everyone lean in to listen. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Oscar was surprised to find himself holding his breath during the exciting parts, not wanting to make a sound that might break the spell of the story. Suddenly, a shrill ringtone pierced the air. Someone had forgotten to silence their phone. The magic of the moment shattered, and Oscar felt a wave of annoyance wash over him. For the first time, he understood why being quiet in the library was so important. The interruption had ruined the best part of the story. As the story concluded, Oscar sat still, lost in thought. He watched as other children quietly discussed their favourite parts of the tale, their hushed voices adding to the cosy atmosphere rather than disrupting it. Curious to explore more, Oscar stood up slowly, making a conscious effort to move quietly. He wandered through the library, noticing things he'd missed in his earlier excitement. He saw students studying at tables, their brows furrowed in concentration. He observed an elderly man reading a newspaper, looking peaceful and content in the quiet surroundings. Then, Oscar discovered something that captivated him. A section with headphones where kids could listen to audiobooks. Intrigued, he slipped on a pair and selected a story about space exploration. As the narrator's voice filled his ears, Oscar was transported to another world. He could hear every word clearly, uninterrupted by background noise or even his own thoughts. For the first time that day, he sat completely still, engrossed in the story. When the chapter ended, Oscar carefully removed the headphones. He looked around the library with new eyes, finally understanding the power of quiet. As the class prepared to leave, Oscar approached Mrs. Page at the front desk. Taking a deep breath, he spoke in his best whisper, which was now soft and controlled. "Mrs. Page," he said, barely above a breath. The librarian looked up, pleasantly surprised at Oscar's transformed demeanour. "Yes, young man?" "I'm sorry I was so loud earlier," Oscar continued, maintaining his whisper. "I didn't realise how important quiet is in a library. It's not just rules, is it? It's about respecting everyone's story time." Mrs. Page's face lit up with a warm smile. "That's exactly right. I'm impressed that you figured that out. Learning to respect quiet spaces is part of growing up. And you know what? The library becomes magical when everyone works together to keep it peaceful." Oscar nodded enthusiastically, his eyes shining. "Can I come back again? I want to hear more stories," quietly. "Of course," Mrs. Page replied. "We'd be delighted to have you. And maybe next time you can help other kids understand about library voices too." On the bus ride home, Oscar sat quietly, reflecting on his day. Jamie, noticing the change, nudged him gently. "You okay, Oscar? You're so quiet. Didn't you like the library?" Oscar turned to his friend with a grin. "I loved it, Jamie. I'm just practicing my library voice. Want to come with me this weekend? I'll show you the awesome audiobook section and we can have a whisper competition." Jamie laughed softly, intrigued by this new side of his usually energetic friend. As the bus rolled on, Oscar gazed out the window, his mind full of the stories he'd discovered and the ones he was excited to explore. He realized that sometimes the biggest adventures happen in the quietest places. You just have to listen closely to hear them. That night, as his mum tucked him in, Oscar whispered, "Mum, can we make a quiet corner in my room? For reading?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. "Of course, dear. Sounds like you had quite a day at the library." Oscar yawned softly, snuggling into his pillow. "Mum," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep, "I think I finally understand why you always say silence is golden. It's like a superpower for imagination." As Oscar drifted off to sleep, he dreamed of endless bookshelves and wonderful whispered stories, eager for his next library adventure. And so, as our story's hero drifts off to sleep, dreaming of endless bookshelves and wonderful whispered stories, we too must say goodnight. But before we go, we have a question for you. Can you think of a time when being quiet helped you discover something amazing? Maybe you heard a bird singing, or noticed a beautiful flower, or had a great idea for a story of your own. Take a moment to share your quiet discovery with your grown-up. Remember, sometimes the biggest adventures happen in the quietest places. You just have to listen closely to hear them. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to share the story with your friends and subscribe to our magical podcast. As the story ends and the children close their eyes, they enter a world where anything is possible. And then they dreamed.